Octa?
No, sir. It's actually a complementary to other investigations, and it's just evolving investigation. Like it's not yet, their normal values have not yet been established. So it still needs like examination and correlation to come to a conclusion that the patient has glaucoma.
Yeah, basically you need to have a normative data first.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
It is the most important thing.
Yes, sir.
And I have a question that you took the severity as the CD ratio. Am I right?
Sorry, sir.
You took the severity of disease as CD ratio.
Yes, sir. And visual fields.
No, but the CD ratio can be highly variable and it has to be taken in correspondence with the disc size. Did you do that? Did you did some correction for the disc size?
No, sir. We corrected with like myopia, depending on the myopic refractive error only we calculated, but we didn't calculate for specifically for the disc area.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Sanjana, I think I believe is ready. Could you like to share your screen now? Dr. Sanjana Rao. Dr. Sanjana Rao is there?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for your.
Thank you.
If Dr. Sanjana is not there, Dr. Devendra Maheshwari. Devendra?
Yes, sir. I am just sharing my screen, sir. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
No. Just a minute. My slides are visible, sir?
No, sir.
Not yet. You're just seeing a white screen.
Please open your first PPT.
Just to guide with that, sir, you have to open the PPT first,
Yeah,
then share the screen.
Now able to see?
Yes, sir, it is visible now.
Just a minute. So good morning, everybody. Thank you, AS, for giving this opportunity. So I am presenting my paper on novel technique of self-placement of Oralab aqueous drainage implant tube into the pseudophakic eyes. No financial interest. So as all we know, the GDD is a popular procedure for the choice in refractory glaucoma. RD is a non-barred implant. Hello.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, go on. Please go ahead. Yeah, we can hear you.
Most significant long-term complication of RD tube stent insertion is the corneal endothelial damage. The technique of tube insertion into the ciliary sulcus and pars plana and pseudophakic eye respectively evade this complication. Pars plana vitrectomy and tube insertion, though the safe when performed by the experienced surgeon, but have the certain complication like RD endophthalmitis, vitreous hemorrhage. Ciliary sulcus, potentially the anatomical space of the tube insertion, especially in the pseudophakic eyes, due to its expansion and anterior posterior length following the cataract owing to the smaller diameter of the intraocular implant as compared to the crystalline lens. Studies have reported the tube placement in the ciliary sulcus to be safe, effective procedure offering the adequate IOP reduction and reduce the endothelial cell loss. So, the commonly employed technique describe the ciliary sulcus placement of GDD tube. The GDD tube have a relatively blind procedure with entry of the 23 and 23 gauge needle, and that lead to the complication like bleeding of anterior chamber, trauma to the iris, ciliary body, zonules, and intraocular lens in displacement, and it may lead to some kind of inaccurate entry behind the PCIOL and maybe the PC rupture also. And it's a very long learning curve. So aim of our study to report the initial clinical outcome of the new technique insertion of the silicone tube into the RD and ciliary sulcus. So in coming to material method, so the retrospective case series taken from July 2019-20, 9 patients were selected. 5 were pseudophakic and 4 were the phakic. Pseudophakic eye underwent the RD implantation, while the phakic with the phaco with RD implantation. So the inclusion criteria: patient age more than 16 years of age and undergoing RD implantation into the sulcus, and at least minimum 3-month follow-up is needed. The complete examination has been done. The indication of RD, neovascular glaucoma, eye syndrome, failed drive, extensive scarring due to the previous surgery. And coming to the surgical technique, a standard surgical technique has been employed. Apart from that, what we did after fixing the RD plate, we cut the tube little bigger, around the 4 mm. And after cutting this tube, we take the 21 gauge needle, we pass through the limbus and going under the ciliary sulcus, and ciliary sulcus coming under this bed. And this tube is fed into the needle, and the needle is withdrawn back like this way. And so the tube nicely goes into the ciliary sulcus, is going to the exact position where we want. So similarly, we see in this animated diagram. So this is the needle, it's passed through the limbus. Through the limbus is going to the ciliary sulcus, and this tube is fed. And after feed this tube, the needle is withdrawn. Once we withdraw the needle, the tube will be inside into the ciliary sulcus. So I think it's a schematic diagram. There is a mean age by the 57.2 is 7.5. I think this is no male female ratio. These are the chart of all the 9 patients who underwent RD implantation. And the pre-operative post-op IP reduced 11.5.56 from the 28.2 at the end of the 3 months of follow-up. And the markedly anti-glaucoma medication has been reduced at the end of 3 months follow-up, and they have the marked improvement in the visual acuity. And the 2 patients had the corneal detachment, the 8-week follow-up. One out of them is subsided by the conservative management. Second one need AC formation, peripheral anterior synechial release, and tube reposition, because this patient had the history of the trauma during the post-operative period. So studies have shown the comparable outcome between sulcus placement and anterior chamber in placement of the tube with higher IOP reduction ratio in the sulcus group. Common technique of sulcus implantation was described by the Wiener and colleagues et al. So the Tilo et al. In their study, the ATI described the ciliary sulcus insertion of barbell shunt through the track of the 23 gauge needle. In contrast to these techniques, main advantage of our ab internal procedure is the accuracy of the tube placement into the sulcus in a controlled fashion by withdrawal of a needle. The ease of the tube insertion may help to shorten the learning curve and enable the training surgeon to attain the accurate tube placement in sulcus, and thus avoiding the need of the multiple entry attempt. In this present case series, there was no patient with hyphema or significant post-operative inflammation, instead of the minimal damage to the angle structure and limited contact to the tube to the iris pigment epithelium within this technique. The significant decrease in IOP and number of AGM was noted in our study, similar to the others. Occurrence of the corneal detachment in 2 patients with the need of the reoperation, one could be attributed to acral glaucoma, again second one lead to the trauma to the patient in post-operative period. There's a limitation of our study. It's retrospective in nature, small sample size, limited follow-up, lack of corneal endothelial kind prior to the procedure. Just to conclude, in conclusion, our technique of sulcus placement of RD, there's a precise and simple technique of the tube insertion. It is a safe to the alternative to the existing technique and avoid the multiple entries, thereby preventing the damage to the adjacent angle structure. Further study is required to validate the long-term safety and efficacy of this technique. Thank you.
Excellent study, Dr. Devendra. I think very unique and novel technique of doing this. I presume the needle is inserted in the opposite limbus and comes in under the iris.
Yes.
And it's a dilated pupil.
Yes, it's dilated pupil.
And how do you watch the position of the tube and the tip of the tube post-operatively when the pupil constricts?
If constricts are really no way to identify unless we dilate, and we used in ciliary sulcus, we keep little bit tube longer in size because it's far away from the endothelium. So it is not going to having any keeping the tube little larger actually. So even the pupillary tube lies on the pupillary margin most of the cases.
Thank you, Devendra. Excellent presentation. And any other questions from the others in the panel?
See, the needle has to be thicker than the tube. So will there not be any leakage on the sides from the sides? Yeah. What is the thickness of the needle that you use? The gauge, how much gauge? 22, 21, what size?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. It's an excellent question. This is a 21 gauge needle is used, and this lack of time didn't describe that needle has not to be go thoroughly. Only the half thickness of the needle has to be come out, and once half thickness come out, we have to feed the tube. So the entry of the needle is not be big actually. It's exactly about to the 23 gauge needle only.
And obviously we can't do it in phakic eyes. It has to be pseudophakic or a phakic.
Yes, sir. This is a limitation of our study. Our study only for pseudophakic eyes.
Okay.
Thank you, Devendra. I think you have one more paper you're going to continue.
I think Sanjana is available right now, sir. If she not, I will be.
Yeah, please go ahead and present.
Can you hear me? I'm Sanjana here. Sorry,
yeah,
I was having audio issues.
Yeah, so you're going to present on choroidal detachment?
Yes, please.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
I'll just be sharing the screen. Share. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes,
Sir.
yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah.
Please go to screen show. Yeah.
Yeah. So, hi, good morning. Presenting regarding the long-term outcomes of choroidal detachment in post-trabeculectomy eyes. No financial disclosures. So, trabeculectomy is one of the most common performed surgeries for glaucoma. They have, however, been noted to have intraoperative and postoperative serous choroidal detachments, which are likely to occur after surgery. And the reported rates range from 7.9 to 8.8%. The early postoperative hypotony and choroidal detachments, they have shown to cause shallow anterior chamber and surgical failure following the trabeculectomy, yet there's scant literature noted regarding its long-term outcomes. We hence aim to assess the long-term outcomes of choroidal detachments in post-trabeculectomy eyes. This was a retrospective non-comparative study where data was retrieved from 45 patients who developed choroidal detachment post-trabeculectomy, either primary trabeculectomy with mitomycin C or along the trabeculectomy done with cataract surgery. The duration was between January 2014 and December 2019. The indication was mainly patients who had uncontrolled glaucoma on maximum tolerated medical therapy and those who had established glaucomatous optic neuropathy with visual fields. The inclusion criteria was mainly patients who developed choroidal detachment after trabeculectomy with mitomycin C, those who had phacoemulsification with trabeculectomy with mitomycin C, or small incision cataract surgery with trabeculectomy and mitomycin C. And those who had more than 1 month follow-up were included as well, and those with the lesser follow-up were excluded. So a complete eye evaluation was done. The follow-up was mainly from postoperative day 1 and then 15, followed by 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, and the final visit. The outcomes were noted as the IOP outcomes and the visual acuity outcomes at each visit. Coming to the results, there were 45 patients who were included in the study, and the male to female ratio was 17:7. The age range was from 13 to 75 years of age. The patients had a mean follow-up of 22 months. The most common type of glaucoma was the open angle glaucoma, which was seen in around 19 patients. I'm sorry, that is the second most common. The most common was angle closure, which was seen 23. The second most common was open angle. And the third most common was urexfoliation glaucoma. The other demographic parameters were diabetes was seen in around 18 patients, hypertension in 18. The pre-op medication was approximately 2 medication. The most common refractive error was astigmatism in these patients. Around 97% were phakic at the time of glaucoma surgeries. 18 eyes had a shallow anterior chamber preoperatively, and 23 eyes had laser peripheral iridotomy. Coming to the anesthesia, 22 eyes received a peribulbar block, 21 eyes received a retrobulbar block, and only 2 had subtenous anesthesia. So out of the 45 eyes, 23 underwent phacotrabeculectomy, 16 underwent plain trabeculectomy with mitomycin C, and 6 underwent small incision cataract surgery with trabeculectomy. 42 patients had 3 scleral flap sutures, and 18 eyes had 1 releasable sutures. There were no intraoperative complications documented. The mitomycin C concentration ranged from 0.4 to 0.2 milligram per ml, and 20 had injection of mitomycin C, and 25 eyes had a sponge application. So coming to choroidal detachment, the mean time for detection was around 16 days. 38 eyes had a large diffuse bleb at the time of presentation. There were no bleb leaks noted at that time, and 3 eyes developed choroidal detachment post-releasable suture removal. 10 eyes developed choroidal detachment after laser suture lysis, and the mean IOP at the time of the choroidal detachment was around 4 millimeters of mercury, and the mean visual acuity was a logMAR 0.60. Regarding the management, all the eyes were managed conservatively with topical steroid, cycloplegic agents, and oral steroids. However, intramuscular dexamethasone was additionally given in about 8 patients. Regarding the ones who needed intervention, 4 eyes, that is 8% patients who didn't respond to conservative management, who had kissing choroidals on ultrasound B scan, underwent choroidal drainage with anterior chamber reformation. The intraocular pressure significantly increased from a mean of 3 millimeters of mercury to 13 in these 4 patients. However, the visual acuity remained unchanged in 2 patients at the final visit. So the IOP outcomes was the IOP at presentation, which was 28 millimeters of mercury. This was the visual acuity outcomes, which was significantly better as compared to the visit at the CD. This was just a bit of a discussion. This has been assessed in eyes with POAG and exfoliation glaucoma and other studies. The mean age has been reported by these studies was slightly comparable to ours. There were more males than females. They had a higher preoperative intraocular pressure than ours. The mean preoperative IOP had ranged from 30 which was slightly higher as compared to ours was 28. Overall, laser suture lysis rates were higher in other studies as compared to ours. The mean number of days from choroidal detachment ranged from 6 days to around 7.9 days, which was comparable. The mitomycin C, however, was 0.4 milligram per ml for 4 minutes. Just the merits and limitations. The merits was this was a large sample size, but relatively rare complication. Long-term follow-up was there. The limitations was its retrospective nature, multiple surgeons performing the procedure, and absence of a comparable group which could have ascertained any risk factors. So to conclude, the choroidal detachment is a relatively rare complication post-trabeculectomy. Although medical management is the mainstay, long-term follow-up is essential to prevent chronic hypotony. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sanjana. Any questions from our co-chairs and convener?
Dr. Rao?
Yes, please.
Did you do ultrasound for each and every patient, or it was just a clinical diagnosis of CD only?
It was mainly it was a retrospective study. So data was just retrieved from the patients who had choroidal detachment, and so it was not really done for each and every patient. So the ones I think at the time of they had the choroidal detachment, it was done as a screening sort of a method to rule out kissing choroidals. So it was probably just done at one visit for all the patients.
Okay. So
any time when okay.
Any relation you found between the size of CD and your final IUP level?
With the size, not exactly. Actually, most of the patients, they had at least around 2 quadrants of choroidal detachment, and they had low IOPs to present with, but the IOP subsequently improved towards the last visit anyway, irrespective of the size of the CD.
Okay.
Any relation with the time removal of lysis of the sutures or removal of sutures?
Actually, yeah. So they out of in our study, we found that the median time was around 16 days usually, and that's the time when all the suture lysis and the wound modulation happens. So in between that time, there were a couple of patients who had laser suture lysis. So they were 10 of them who had choroidal detachment after laser suture lysis during that time.
Any difference between the injectable and the non-injectable, the sponge application mitomycin?
Yeah. So actually, in our study, there was the sponge they were kind of equal number of eyes actually served. 25 had sponge application and 20 had injection.
Which had more choroidals?
We basically didn't randomize them into, we didn't put into 2 groups as such to see that, but it was almost equal numbers who had that.
No, it will be interesting to know whether the injectable
Yeah.
technique which many of us are following, is there a difference in choroidal rate of choroid?
Yes, that will be quite interesting to find out, but we didn't really see
Yeah. Thank you,
correlate
Dr.
the
Sanjana.
choroidals with
Thank you, Dr. Sanjana. I think in the interest of time, we would move on to the next presentation by Dr. Rashmi Kumari. Please share your screen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, are my slides visible?
Yeah.
Good evening all. And in the next few slides, I will be presenting my research on a new drug called Ripasudil, evaluating its efficacy and safety in a particular set of glaucoma patients. I have absolutely no financial interests. So we all know that for the past 1.5 years, the whole world is facing the pandemic of COVID-19, which has hit the healthcare delivery system really hard. Patients suffering from various diseases are suffering a lot, and glaucoma patients are no exception to this. Situations becomes even worse for those who are on the verge of losing vision, unless intervened actively with surgery or laser. But on a positive note, as a good news, Ripasudil, a member of new class of drug Rho kinase inhibitors, has recently been made available in India, though it was approved in 2014 itself. And since its approval, it has been evaluated as monotherapy or combination therapy in glaucoma patients with encouraging results. These ROCK inhibitors work in glaucoma patients by various mechanisms like neuroprotection, decreasing scarring, increasing the ocular blood flow, and protecting the retinal ganglion cell itself, but of course, above all, IOP reduction. And their mechanism of lowering IOP is due to the modulation of cellular cytoskeleton in the subclavicular meshwork, and hence decreasing the outflow resistance in conventional pathway. This supposed mechanism is entirely different from what is available for other classes of these glaucoma medications. Hence, it can be hypothesized that it should fetch few more millimeter of IOP reduction over other medications. And with this research question in mind, we propose to evaluate the safety and efficacy and tolerability of Ripasudil in patients of glaucoma with inadequately controlled IOP with maximum medical therapy. Inadequately controlled implies the patients are not able to achieve their target IOP even on the maximum tolerable medical management. Ethical clearance was taken, and a prospective non-comparative interventional case series study was designed at the Tertiary Eye Care Center from March 2020 to September 2020, the phase when the whole world was facing the first wave of COVID-19. Patients of open-angle glaucoma more than 35 years of age not achieving the target IOP as per Anderson classification despite treatment, but IOP less than 30 mm of FG one included, but those with angle closure or secondary glaucoma, history of prior laser or surgery allergy, or congestion, visual acuity less than 20/200, or any severe visual field effects were excluded. After getting basic ophthalmic workup with maintaining COVID protocol, one drop of Ripasudil was instilled into the target eye twice daily in addition to the existing glaucoma regimen for 3 months, and follow-up was planned for first, second, and third month when applanation tonometry for IOP as method examination was done for the patients. The patients were required to fill a questionnaire for any associated systemic symptoms, or if yes, then what was the time of onset and what was the duration of its persistence. Degree of IOP reduction after 3 months from the primary outcome measure, while the incidence of adverse event from the secondary outcome measure. So coming to the results, at the end of this study, we had a total of 42 eyes of 38 patients who completed the study and were analyzed with mean number of medications before enrollment 3.57 and a baseline IOP of 19.1 with standard deviation of 4.5 mm. It was found that a persistent decrease in IOP was noted at first, second, and third month, and these values were statistically analyzed during the tailed student test for this data to get the percentage reduction of IOP as compared to baseline. And it was found that the mean IOP reduction of -2.6, the percentage reduction at first month was 13.5%, and at third month it was with a mean reduction of -4.2 mm of mercury. Finally we got an IOP reduction in percentage of 16.8%. And target IOP was achieved in 18 eyes, which constituted 42.8% of our patients. As far as the adverse reactions are concerned, conjunctival congestion was the most commonly encountered problem in 23 eyes. The congestion started within 15 minutes of drug instillation and it persisted for 1 to 2 hours, as reported by 92% of the patients. One patient reported blepharitis, but all these symptoms were mild and transient, requiring no other extra medications, and none of the patients dropped out of this study because of these complaints. Coming to the dealing with this literature, It has been found when Ripasudil is used as monotherapy, it has an IUP reduction of as high as 19.3%. But in combination with timolol and latanoprost, the IUP reduction found mentioned in the literature is 17.2 and 13.8 respectively. A similar study evaluating it as an add-on therapy has documented an IUP reduction of 15.5, which is comparable to our study, which we got as an IUP reduction of 16.8%. Conjunctival congestion remains the most commonly documented side effect, with an incidence as high as 100% in one of the study. We got a percentage of 54.7% of conjunctival congestion in our patient. Some of the studies have reported keratitis as well, but we didn't get any patients of keratitis or any other visual threatening complaints. One patient reported blepharitis, which has also been mentioned in other studies. So, at the end of the study, we can conclude that the additional use of Ripasudil is effective and well tolerated in patients who are already on vaccine medical therapy. And it may help to avoid laser pupilloplasty or glaucoma surgery for at least for short duration of time. Though we admit that small sample size and short duration of follow-up remains our shortcomings, and to get the final picture of long-term efficacy and safety of this drug, we need to have long-term comparative study and clinical trials. But at this point, we can definitely say that this new emerging drug therapy has given a ray of hope for these difficult patients in such difficult situations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rashmi. Professor Manavdeep Singh, you want to ask anything?
Not really much in this, but the only thing is that as we know that every next drug that is added to the treatment gives less and less additive effect.
Absolutely.
So a drug which is used as monotherapy giving 17% and again as a fourth drug or a fifth drug giving the equivalent amount, I think this needs to be reassessed and further more bigger studies are required for this.
Dr. Shakeen Singh, any questions?
Any relation when you use it with parasympathetic drugs? Am I audible?
Dr. Rashmi, are you there?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I'm here. Can you repeat the question, sir?
So any relation when it's used with parasympathetic drugs?
No, not exactly.
No.
Not any typical.
Right.
Thank you. And I think we now move on to our next paper on assessment of anxiety and depression by Dr. Ashutosh. Dr. Ashutosh, are you there? Please share your screen. Yeah, please share your screen.
So are my slides visible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Ashutosh Dayal, and I'm going to discuss our study titled Assessment of Anxiety and Depression in Patients with Primary Glaucoma at a Tertiary Care Eye Center. So glaucoma. Okay. So we don't have any financial or any conflict of interest in the study. Coming to the introduction, glaucoma, as we all know, is a major cause of blindness globally. And as per study estimates, there are more than 80 million people suffering from glaucoma worldwide, out of which more than 12 million are in India itself. It's a chronic, irreversible optic neuropathy, which can lead to potential blindness if left untreated. And as with other chronic diseases, the glaucoma was also found to be associated with psychological disturbances such as anxiety and depression. So various factors such as visual field defects, then chronic lifelong treatment, then treatment-related adverse effects such as the oculocephaly disorders caused by the anti-glaucoma medications. And in a country like India, the financial aspects are also important, as well as a diagnosis of potentially blinding condition can lead to instill fear and anxiety in patients with glaucoma, which can ultimately lead to impairment of the quality of life. Hence, it was essential to monitor and to assess the prevalence of psychological disorders in the patients with glaucoma, which was also the aim of our study. Coming to the methodology, it was a cross-sectional observation study which was conducted in a tertiary care eye hospital on patients with diagnosis of primary glaucoma who are attending the outpatient department. All patients underwent a thorough clinical examination, including slit lamp examination, tonometry, gonioscopy, Humphrey's visual field examination, and fundus examination. All patients with secondary glaucoma, any ocular disease significantly impairing visual function, any other gross physical disability, and patients with prior history of psychiatric disease or psychiatric treatment were excluded from the study. We utilized the Hodder-Parrish-Anderson's criteria on the better eye to categorize the patients into mild, moderate, and severe based on disease severity. Patients were asked to respond to the HADS or hospital anxiety and depression questionnaires, and the responses were analyzed statistically. The HADS questionnaire in a brief, it's basically a self-administered questionnaire that is used as a screening tool. It consists of two sets of 7 questions each. This A is for the anxiety questions and D is for the depression questions. And each question is graded as per the Likert-like scoring system from 0 to 3. So the maximum marks for every subset is 21 and the minimum is 0. And any score which is equal to more than 8 is suggestive of borderline or doubtful cases, and anything more than 11 is definite cases or the cases with high suspicion of disease. Coming to our results, the baseline characteristics of the population were mean sample size was 200, out of which 51 patients had undergone a prior filtering surgery. The mean HADS-A and HADS-D scores were 4.5 and 4.1. 97 patients had mild disease, 55 had moderate disease, and 48 had severe disease, as per the Hodai-Parrish-Anderson's criteria. Coming to the effect of disease severity on HADS scores, so the blue bars indicate the HADS depression and reds into the HADS-A scales, and we can see that as a disease severity increases from mild to severe, there is increase in the HADS scores in both HADS-A and HADS-D, signifying that with the worsening of the disease, the probability of developing anxiety and depression is more in the patients. All the differences were significant statistically. Whereas when we compared the effect of treatment duration on the HADS scores, we did not find any statistically significant difference in the HADS scores in the 3 treatment duration groups. Coming to the prevalence of anxiety and depression based on the HADS scale, so we took the cutoff value as more than equal to 8 for as the cutoff for diagnosing as a borderline or suspicious cases. So we found that the 14% patient had symptomatic for anxiety, while 20% patient was symptomatic for depression in the study group. Also, the patient who underwent a prior surgical intervention had poorer HADS, anxiety, and depression scores as compared to those who are only on the medical management. So this might be influenced by the fact that at our center, the surgical intervention was usually done on the patient who had very severe disease, which was not controlled by medical management. The Pearson correlation coefficient between the two subscales was plus 0.794, suggesting of a high internal consistency between the two subscales. So glaucoma, this study also proved that glaucoma is associated with significant prevalence of anxiety and depression. And some of the other studies which were done previously have also mentioned that a variable prevalence of anxiety and depression from 6 to 64% for anxiety and 7 to 42% for depression. Although these variation might be due to the fact that some studies have used a different questionnaire to assess the anxiety and depression. Also, the study population was different. But we still feel that these prevalence rates might be just be the tip of the iceberg, because we might be missing out some subclinical or very mild symptomatic cases. And disease progression was associated with the increased risk of developing negative emotions as seen from the study. But the emotional disturbances appear to be independent of the disease duration. This means that patients with a recent diagnosis of glaucoma can also have the negative psychological emotions, anxiety, and depression. And this was confirmed by studies done by Odberg et al., who found 80% patients having negative emotion on just hearing the diagnosis of the glaucoma. All these factors are attributed to fear of blindness, poor disease comprehension among the population, as well as lack of awareness about the treatment options among the general masses. Hence, the holistic approach, including psychological screening and patient counseling, might be beneficial in the long term in the treatment of glaucoma. Hence, we conclude that patients with glaucoma are prone to develop emotional disturbances. Hence, apart from giving medical or surgical treatment, clinicians should also focus on comprehensive approach consisting of patient education, psychological assessment, periodic counseling to provide patients with a better quality of life. These are our references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ashutosh. I think good presentation and a very basic question. Does the glaucoma induce the anxiety and depression? So what is the mental state of the patient before the diagnosis of glaucoma? Any way of assessing that and knowing whether the patient had an underlying anxiety and depression and the glaucoma was just on top of that?
Sir, actually for that, we'll have to do a psychological workup for the patient, because once we diagnose the patient as glaucoma, then it's difficult to make out whether it's just due to glaucoma or patient.
That's the doubt I had, because suppose the patient has a pre-existing anxiety, depression, and you have the glaucoma on top of it.
Yes, sir.
Does it get worse and so on? Secondly, your questionnaire was in English. Was it self-administered and was it changed into a local language?
Sir, actually we changed it into a local, we changed it into Hindi and Marathi and validated that questionnaire by reverse translation.
It was
And
validated.
yes, sir. And those patients who were still unable to comprehend the questions, we provide them with a neutral hospital employee who could, translate the question for them in the easier words, so that the patient could mark their response.
Any other questions, panel?
Did you differentiate between patients who are well controlled or patients who had too many medications and still progressing?
Sir, actually, it was a cross-section study, so we could not do much of the long-term follow-up, like repeated. Actually, we should have done the repeated follow-up of this scale, how the score is advancing in patients who are not controlled by treatment. But since we're a cross-section study, so we did not do follow-up based on the progression of the glaucoma.
Any relation to literacy and IQ level of the patient?
So literacy definitely should have a relationship, but we did not analyze this in this study, as half of the patients that we were catering were from the rural background, more of the laborers and the agriculture workers.
Exactly.
So we could not assess at this time, but maybe next time if you plan a bigger study, we might consider that into the consideration.
I think that is the most important thing which we need to look.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ashutosh. And we now move on to the next one. Dr. Pratibha is there. She would present the paper on micropulse diode laser.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Good morning. My presentation is on efficacy of micropulse laser diode photocoagulation. So refractive glaucoma is defined as uncontrolled glaucoma despite maximum medications and surgery. Patients with refractive glaucoma and no visual potential is ideally treated with cyclodestructive procedures. But patients with refractive glaucoma and a good visual potential are first treated with filtering surgeries. Of late, micropulse laser diode laser photocoagulation has been proven to be very efficient in patients with refractive glaucoma. The mechanism of action between the conventional diode and micropulse cyclophotocoagulation is slightly different. The conventional diode has a continuous laser delivery which causes thermal damage and thereby it decreases the production of aqueous humor. Whereas in micropulse, there is repetitive short pulses with an on and off cycling mode of laser delivery, which causes minimal collateral disruption. There is biochemical cascade dysregulation, which causes an increase in uveoscleral outflow rather than thermal damage to the ciliary epithelium. So micropulse laser procedure is generally being done in the theater setting under peribulbar anesthesia. Micropulse probe, MP3 probe is used, and it is specifically designed with and the power used is 2000 megawatts and a duty cycle of 31.3%. The fiber optic tip is specifically designed, which has a piezoelectric crystal inside, and a continuous sweeping motion is done in the superior hemisphere and the inferior hemisphere, trying to avoid 3 and 9 o'clock for about 80 seconds in both the hemispheres. So why this study? This study, the technology was relatively new, and it has been proven to have less adverse effects and can be used to control intraocular pressure even in patients with good vision. And there were no Indian studies at the time of abstract submission. So we aim to evaluate the efficacy and safety of micropulse transscleral diode photocoagulation in Indian eyes with refractive glaucoma. It's a prospective interventional study in a tertiary eye hospital. After ethics committee approval, all eyes had visual acuity and intraocular pressure measurement at baseline. A single surgeon treated all eyes, and visual acuity and intraocular pressure was measured at 1 week, 1 month, and 3 months. Surgical success was defined as achieving an IOP between 8 to 21 millimeters or achieving 20% IOP reduction, and IOP of less than 8 was considered undesirable. We included all patients with IOP of more than 21 with refractive glaucoma, with advanced glaucomatous clumping, painful blind eye. We include patients who were poorly compliant, and all type of glaucomas who were refractory were included. We excluded patients with history of recent ocular surgery, who had ocular infection, inflammation, scleral thinning, and who were not willing for follow-up. A comprehensive ocular examination was done. IOP measurement was done in the baseline and post-procedure at 1 week, 1 month, and 3 months. The number and type of glaucoma medications used were noted. The procedure was done as I explained earlier. We had 55 eyes in our study. The average age was 56. Males were more. Secondary glaucomas were more in our study. Among the secondary glaucomas, post-trabeculectomized and AV valve surgeries were more. The average intraocular pressure pressures that significantly decreased from the baseline in first week, 1 month, and third month. By applying the surgical success criteria, which we had mentioned, the surgical success was attained at 1 week, 1 month, and third month in all our patients. There was reduction in glaucoma medication usage in from 2.9 to 2, and 1 patient had hypotony. There was reduction in visual acuity from baseline in 15 eyes. Among that, 5 had more than 2-line difference, and 10 had 1-line drop in vision from the baseline. Coming on to discussion, there was a significant decrease in intraocular pressure and number of topical medication use and tablet use. There were no major complications noted in our study. Our success rate was similar to other studies. The slight reduction in vision could be explained possibly because of the transient postoperative inflammation, which was explained by Caranzaro et al. In a study who also found a similar reduction in vision. Caranzaro et al. Also added that there was a reduction in efficacy of therapy with time. Poor response were noted in secondary glaucomas. Because of prolonged inflammation, there's a chronic fibrovascular change over the pars plana, and that can inhibit the penetration of laser. However, we had good response in our post-PK eyes. From the date of invention of this micropulse laser, there have been dozens of publications from of micropulse laser with varying techniques and innovations. However, this was a latest publication from Journal of Glaucoma. It's a multi-center study which has studied on 143 patients. They have reported that micropulse laser definitely lowers the IOP, but the effect was short-term, and nearly half required additional IOP lowering intervention in the near future. And potential complications like decrease in vision should be explained to the patient when the vision is relatively good. The advantage in our study was it's done by a single surgeon and a uniform protocol was performed. The limitation was it had a very short follow-up, and detailed evaluation of adverse effects of inflammation and other by imaging was not performed. To conclude, micropulse laser is safe and effective for refractive glaucoma, but it is not the primary treatment of glaucoma. Patients can expect significant IOP lowering with reduction of medications. However, it is not permanent and laser augmentation might be required. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pratibha. And I am a co-author for this study, so I am not going to judge this paper. I request the panelists and the chair, co-chair to ask the questions.
As you rightly mentioned, that this study had, this technique is likely to have, long-term drift, I mean, the reduction in the efficacy. So are you continuing this study for future follow-up and then giving us more data in the near future?
We are continuing the study, sir, and we have not analyzed the results as of now, but we are continuing the study.
How much was the sweeping time?
Sweeping time was 80 seconds in the superior hemisphere and in the inferior hemisphere. So the total time we had done was 160 seconds, sir.
So was it not too high?
That is a standard protocol followed by the company. I think I'm the person who has done the study actually. I was a single surgeon. And this is a standard protocol given by the company, and I've been following that for the last, this is the 3rd year we have been doing it now. This is a standard, worldwide standard, and we have not changed the duration or the power. Occasionally in a second sitting or second time treatment, I sometimes reduce the power rather than change the duration. And the sweep time can be altered, the sweep duration can be altered and so on. But the exact duration I have generally not altered.
Okay, sir.
How many, since you say the effect is transient, and after how much time you note that pressure has returned to the baseline position, and how many times you can repeat it?
Sir, we have not analyzed our studies, but according to literature and according to the recent multi-center study, they have said nearly 50% of the eyes had needed retreatment by 11 months. They have done a study that their average duration of study was 12 months. And in their patients, they have found that 50% required retreatment. However, we would do our analysis, and we would also think of publication of that long-term efficacy, sir.
Amongst your indication, you have told painful blind eye.
Sorry, sir.
Amongst your indications for surgery,
Yes,
you
sir.
have given the painful blind eye.
Yes, sir.
What was the amount of IOP lowering we obtain in those patients? What's the need? Why we prefer this procedure there?
Sir, in painful blind eyes, the intraocular pressure is one of the reasons when there is high intraocular pressure, there is painful blind eye. So in spite of maximum medications, the pressure doesn't, when the pressure doesn't come down, we prefer doing this procedure because it is relatively safer than the conventional diode laser photocoagulation, wherein there are high chances of hypotony. So we prefer micropulse laser even in painful blind eyes.
But what was the amount of IOP lowered by this procedure in the painful
I think
blind?
maybe I could answer that. I think when painful blindness, essentially the need, as Dr. Pratibha pointed, the need for doing it was the reason to lower intraocular pressure in comparison to the continuous way which we were doing earlier. The IOP drop has actually been a little less than what we would observe for a post-PK glaucoma or for a neovascular glaucoma. We don't have a subgroup analysis of the extent of IOP lowering in different subgroups, but in my sort of so-called unpublished experience, I can tell you that the IOP lowering in painful blind eye with a very, very high pressures of 50, 60 and beyond with maximum medication would probably be about between 30 to 50% as compared to 25 to 30% with the other secondary glaucoma. But we don't have the data, exact data as yet.
Thank you.
Can we move on, sir?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can move on to that.
Yeah, I think this is the last paper for the session. This would be the magnitude of POAG in obstructive sleep apnea. Yeah, Dr. Sushmita, please.
Morning, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Just a second, sir. I will. Is it visible, sir?
Yeah. Yes, yes, visible.
I will just.
Please start speaking, Ma.
Good morning, everyone. My topic for today is the magnitude of primary open-angle glaucoma in patients with obstructive sleep apnea syndrome. It is an observational study. There is no financial interest. So to start with, what is OSAS? It is characterized by repeated episodes of partial or complete obstruction, upper airway obstruction during the sleep, interrupting or reducing the flow of air, followed by transient awakenings, which will again restore the upper airway permeability. So these cycles of apnea and hypopnea are repeated several times every hour, which will produce a very impaired sleep cycle. OSAS has a huge negative impact on the health and lifestyle of adolescents, and it's an independent risk factor for many cardiovascular incidents as well. It is second only to bronchial asthma in the respiratory disease load of our country. On the other hand, glaucoma is also an optic neuropathy, which will cause tissue damage at the level of retinal ganglion cells in the optic nerve head. Thereby, it will create alteration in the structure and appearance of the optic disc, as well as severe visual field disturbances. It is a subset of the glaucoma where there is a normal appearing anterior chamber angle, which is open, and it may or may not be accompanied by raised IOP as well. So what is the pathophysiology in OSAS patients that will cause glaucoma? It is basically threefold. Most predominantly is the hypoxia factor, which will cause severe oxidative stress and inflammation and mitochondrial dysfunctions in the retinal ganglion cells, leading to glaucoma. Secondarily, these are the vascular dysfunction factors, which will lead to sympathetic activity, vascular dysregulation, increase of ICP and IOP, and it will cause glaucoma. Thirdly, some factors like obesity and supine positions also play a role, which will increase the IOP. So what is the aim of our study? Glaucoma is the third highest cause of blindness in a huge country like ours. And the presentation of this monstrous disease is often silent and symptomless. So if we can establish a positive correlation between OSAS and POAG, it will help us in screening and early diagnosis of this deadly disease. This is an observational study which was carried out jointly by both departments of ophthalmology and pulmonary medicine in the tertiary care center. Over a period of 1 year, 72 patients were first diagnosed as OSAS, admitted under pulmonary medicine, and subsequently evaluated for POAG. These patients presented to us with symptoms of loud snoring, nocturnal awakening, choking. Some had nocturia, some had excessive daytime somnolence, unrefreshing sleeps, and they presented with signs like obesity, increased neck size. Some had hypothyroidism and acromegalic features as well. We performed overnight polysomnography and transcutaneous finger oximetry in these patients to diagnose OSAS. The severity of these patients were then graded according to the AHI score per hour. Apnea here is defined as the complete cessation of oronasal flow for 10 seconds or more, whereas hypopnea is the partial reduction of the oronasal flow of 50% or more. So most of the studies said that if AHI is more than 5%, we can establish the patient as an OSA patient. This is then further classified between mild, moderate, and severe OSA as well. Another scale to see apart from AHI is the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, which is also an important screening test for OSA. Now, subsequently, once these patients were diagnosed as OSA, then we performed the ophthalmological examinations of them. Namely, visual acuity was tested by the Snellen's chart. Slit lamp examination was done to see for the anterior chamber depth. Corneal pachymetry was done. Apprenation tonometry was done. Gonioscopy was done with a Goldman 2-mirror gonioscope. Then we had the fundus and detailed disc evaluation with a 78D Vauquelin and direct ophthalmoscope. And finally, we did a perimetry with HFA 24-2 threshold to see for the visual field defects. So first a proposal was made, ethical clearance was taken, all patients of OSA were diagnosed, consent was taken from them. Then we had done tests for the ocular findings. After that, once they were established as POAG, then we had the charting of data. So what are the results? Out of all the 72 cases of OSA, 9 cases were found to have POAP, which comes to a whopping amount of 12.25%, whereas in the normal population, the incidence is only 2%. So as per the OSA grade, 8 out of our 26 cases fell in the severe grade of OSA. If we take them according to the EPSS scale, then most of our patients fell into the very sleepy or dangerously sleepy categories of OSA. In our study, we also found that prevalence of POAG was most among smokers, dyslipidemics, hypertensive diabetics, and some hypothyroid patients. So here this figure shows that the prevalence of glaucoma in the sleep apnea patients was 12.25, which is also in correspondence to previous studies by Karakusu, who had also shown that it was their incidence was 12.9. In some studies, the prevalence was almost as high up to 27% too. Here we see the second figure, distribution of POAG according to different grades of OSA. If we take them according to the AHI scale, we see that maximum of our patients fell into the severe OSA category. That is 7 out of 27 of our cases. This is also in tandem with the previous studies done by Hashim et al. So it shows that more severe is the OSA, more likely is a patient to be diagnosed with POAP. And the last, the figure here shows the distribution of POAG in accordance with the EPSS group, which as mentioned before, our maximum of patients fell into the very sleepy or the dangerously sleepy categories. Here we see the distribution of POAG cases in our study according to the different risk factor groups. So we see that out of the maximum of our patients, there were 23 smokers. So smoking is a very, very important modifiable risk factor that can lead to POAG. Previous studies by Wise, Can, Bonovas, Kirotuju also showed that smoking is a very important risk factor. It causes vasoconstriction and elevated epidural venous pressure, which will lead to increased IOP. Other important risk factors that we found to increase POAG was CVA, stroke, which caused ischemic changes to the optic disc. Dyslipidemia and hypertensive changes caused a compromised peripheral vascular capacity and damaged autoregulation. And hypothyroid patients were also at an increased risk to develop POAG because of the hyaluronic acid deposition in the trabecular network. So when we treat hypothyroidism, it is also found that the incidence of POAG or the IOP subsequently lowers after treatment. So to conclude, OSA is a major risk factor for developing glaucoma. There's a high prevalence of POAG in the OSAS group as compared to the general population. Higher the grade of OSS, more the propensity for development of POAG. The percentage of development of POAG is much more in the very sleepy and the dangerously sleepy grades of EPSS, and smoking, stroke, hyperlipidemia, hypertension, hypothyroidism, diabetes are possible risk factors for development of POAG. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shushmita. I think I must remind you that you exceeded your time, even though you tried to do quite a lot in a short time. So that's okay. Yeah, that's okay. The question I have for you is, do you do in your practice, in your hospital or institution, do you do a sleep study in all your glaucoma patients?
No, this was actually, we did the study to establish the correlation actually.
So my question, did you do it in all your glaucoma patients in your hospital?
No, we do not.
When would you do it in your routine practice? When would you do it in real life?
In real life, if we see that there is a patient of glaucoma and the patient has also these associated comorbidities that will also lead to OSAs, then we would probably, like if the patient is obese, if the patient has cardiovascular risk factors, then probably we would ask the patient to do OSAs, a study for OSAs. Also, doing the study, we learned these scales of EPSS and AHI when we were doing the questionnaires. So we learned that we can also present ourselves.
Is it enough to do just a questionnaire for sleep evaluation?
No, sir, but it is better than not doing anything. It will at least help us to screen mildly if the patient has OSA. Once we find that the patient is at risk of developing OSA, we'll refer it to pulmonary medicine for a proper polysomnography.
I request the other panelists to.
I wanted to know any relationship of duration of OSA but I wanted to know with the duration.
Could you repeat the question, Professor Mana? I think you went off for some time.
Okay, I wanted to know that was there any relationship of duration of OSAS with the development of glaucoma?
No,
he
sir.
has presented.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I could not establish the relation of the duration because in the questionnaire that we took, we did not have the column for duration. We had columns for symptoms, how it affects the lifestyle, but for what period of time, that was not we did not categorize it. So that was one parameter that was left out.
Dr.
We could not
Sushmita.
find the column. Yes, sir. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. OSA is cured or relieved by CPAP or BPAP, what we give. Then does it have, after using those appliances,
Yes,
does it have any effect on the glaucoma?
I could not gather significant data because we did not, in all 72 of the patients, we did not follow up the case. Maximum were lost to us on follow-up. But like of the few that we did, after the CPAP treatment that they underwent and reduction of weight, then we followed up some patients, and in some of them we found that there was a reduction of IOP to some extent, not a significant. But I cannot establish the relation since all 72 of them did not turn up for follow-ups, so we did not document that. It is still pertaining to further study, sir.
I think we have come to the thank you.
Murli, I think we have 1 minute in which I can utilize by asking a question from Devendra Maheshwari, if he is there online.
Devendra, are you there?
Devendra Maheshwari.
The one on RD.
Yeah. So
sulcus placement. Yeah.
So I just asked a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Anyway, if it's there, it can answer. Most of the surgeries that were done in this study, they were almost 2/3. They were cataract plus glaucoma combined studies. So I just wanted to understand whether this is a combined surgery which is the cause of choroidal detachment, or it's a usual incidence in their institution that 2/3 surgeries of baclectomy are combined with the cataract surgery. So this is what I wanted to understand.
Is Dr. Sanjana there? I think she also was a co-author. So Sanjana is there? Anyone from Arvind Tirunelveli? I think they all.
Okay.
I think it's like our audience. They all disappeared. I think moment they present. Anyway, I think we just got 30 seconds more for the session, and would you like to give the final remarks, Dr. Rana, Dr. Shiraz?
Yeah, all the presentations were no doubt very good. And I think the last presenter was a non-rectified member. Huh?
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. So we don't need to
Mark those.
evaluate
Yes,
her, huh?
correct.
Okay.
So thank you all and a very good morning. I think good to start off on a very academic note in the morning. And thank you all for being present.
Thank you so
And I
much.
think-
Thank you, Murli, and thank you
Bye.
everybody.
Yeah, thank you all and